of Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media. A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be back in the saddle again for a live program across FM and AM in the capital of the Liberty Movement, Florida, particularly here in Central Florida, the heart of what's going on as Florida continues to remember what it means to be a free people. Slowly but surely, we're reclaiming our liberties bit by bit, piece by piece in this state, and the whole world tunes in to see exactly what's coming next. And it's not about just one person, a governor or state legislature. It's about an atmosphere. It's about momentum. It's about a culture of people that are saying, you know what, we're not going to have mandated medicine and mandated this or that. We're not going to have nihilism taught in classrooms for little kids to be confused. All that stuff has no place in a civilized society, and yet many people want to double down on stupid in other states, other places around this country. They want to double down on, messing with the innocence of kids, messing with the boundaries of what is an adult and what is a child thing. Everything's just all blended together when you let nihilism become your guiding light, your guiding principle to move forward. And I think it's a product of our never-ending adventures overseas that really, when you lose your mind trying to fight over and over again and failing to create a deep, true war victory that unites the people and says, that was a just thing we did there. When that doesn't happen, I think it has a way of destroying the sanity of people back at home. And I think that's what we're going through right now. Joining me to explore the latest and what's happening with our foreign policy is a returning guest, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How are you doing today?
Fine, David. Good to talk with you.
Very good. I wanted to start off with this story I saw headlined along all kinds of outlets. CNBC.com says the U.S. Army is struggling to find the recruits it needs to win the fight over the future. The U.S. Army fell short of its 2022 recruitment goal by 25% and recently cut its projection for its total force for this year by 10,000. And they said that it's becoming harder for the military to compete for recruits. And this is a big issue. Folks are considering this to be a problem for the maintenance of what people expect from the military. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, that's an important question, and I wish more people would ask it. I think people need to remember something, that historically armies depend upon able-bodied, physically fit, mentally competent young men between the ages of 18 and 30 to survive. That's the lifeblood of any army, because those are the people that are going to go out and fight and win the battles and the wars that you're inevitably going to end up fighting in. This is something we've lost sight of. And if you're a young man between the ages of 18 and 30, single, healthy, you're looking at the military as a potential profession or simply a place where you can serve your country for some period of time, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it turns out to be. You see that the military is saying, well, we really love all of these people who are different, transgender, whatever particular brand of LGBTQ you want to talk about. And the average young man says, well, wait a minute, where do I fit in? And then the Army recruiter tells you, well, this little girl over here who's 18, 19, 20, weighs about 120 pounds. If she can do everything you can do, there's no difference between you and her. You're exactly the same. See, we've made her a combat soldier. Well, then the young man says, well, look, if that's what you want, and that is what you think can do all of the things that I personally know in my gut cannot be done by her, well, then I guess you don't need me in the Army. And so the result is that you've got an enormous problem with trying to find people that will join the force. Now, one of the other excuses that's given is that, well, a lot of people aren't healthy. Some people have records with the police and all sort of business. Look, I served for 28 years in the Army, and I can tell you some of the best soldiers that served with me in my 28 years were actually people that had done some time. I'll be frank with you. You know, we're not talking about serial murderers or perverts or rapists, but people do from time to time get into trouble with the police. That doesn't mean that they're incapable of being good soldiers. So I think we've got a huge problem with image, a huge problem with, you know, why should I join this organization? It doesn't seem to be interested in being special, in being a hard-charging, hard-fighting organization. And so people won't show up.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks saying that maybe they've gone too far in their attempt to purge folks who they consider to be extremists. There's also the mandates. That's a big component of this, would you say? The vaccine mandates?
Of course, and you know as well as I do that extreme is whatever the current administration tells you is extreme.
Right.
If you tell someone, well, I'm a Christian, I go to church every Sunday, and I have certain tasks I want to perform, I want to teach Sunday school or something else, well, this man's obviously an extremist by definition, if that's the definition of the day. So I think that's part of it. I talked to a young sailor who was getting out of the Navy because he said the church he belonged to had been listed as an extremist organization. And he said, you know, sir, I've been going to that church since I was a child. I've never seen anything extreme about it unless being extreme means that you're trying to be a good human being.
Right. So if that's what they're calling extremists, who is it that's setting this policy? Is it the HR department in the Pentagon? How does that work?
Oh, no. This starts at the top. This starts in the White House. It's supported by the Congress, and remember who controls Congress. And the appointees, the political appointees who are sent over there to make sure that these policies are implemented. And then, of course, you've got this whole problem with affirmative action on steroids now, this thing called equity, which is supposed to punish people because they're not the member of a special group. Special groups may be African Americans, they may be Native Americans, whatever the administration says. So the whole notion of a meritocracy is dead. And one of the things that used to attract people into the military was they thought that this was a clean slate. This is where you could go in, and based on your demonstrated character, competence, and brains, you could actually get somewhere and achieve something. And now the perception is no. You know, I'm going to be punished for who I am or what I think, and people walk away from it.
Right. Yeah, it's a
and by
different
the way,
entity.
all of this in the middle of a crisis or a conflict, where people in Washington are actually considering seriously using U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine. Well, if you can't even maintain the strength of your current army, which is only supposed to be about 480,000, 485,000, if you can't maintain that, you're down to, say, 460,000 or 470,000. You could be drawn into a fight in Ukraine, which I think is insane. But if we were to send forces over there, you have to reckon with the experience of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have had, truthfully, over 100,000 men killed since this business began 7 months ago, or almost 8, and they've got 300,000 or 400,000 wounded. Well, if you look at those numbers, it's not hard to figure out that that's almost the size of the United States Army. So who are we kidding? This is pure insanity.
I saw that Darren Beatty, who runs Revolver.news, a news aggregator site, he shared a comment that he said that kind of set the tone for what people are talking about. It says, Eric Stryker is reporting that the U.S. military is offering white nationalist ex-soldiers a chance to come back. And it says, this must be absolutely rough behind the scenes. It says, here's a scoop. A man I know who was discharged from the military, harassed by the FBI for being a neo-Nazi 3 years ago, was contacted by a warrant officer the other day begging him to re-enlist in exchange for $30,000 and a complete wipe of his record. If he took the deal, he was asked to close all of his internet activity down and sign an NDA to not reveal this. I mean, I don't know. It's just a rumor, but I mean, what is that something that people?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, right now we are actually through NATO paying for ISIS fighters and Al Qaeda members in northeast Syria to go to Ukraine and fight for Ukraine against the Russians.
They're still on the I didn't know they were still on the dole. ISIS is still on the dole?
Yeah, well, there's 70 of them apparently are now in Ukraine, and they're being handsomely paid to go there and try to kill Orthodox Christian Russians on behalf of Orthodox Christian Ukrainians. I mean, this is.
I thought Trump said he. Wait a second. I thought Trump said that he wiped out all of ISIS. I don't. They get him back again.
Well, I think people lose sight of the fact that Mr. Erdogan in Turkey did everything in his power to rescue as many of those people as possible, so that he could repurpose them and use them in a different setting. And Erdogan in Turkey was providing all the intelligence and a lot of the support to stand up ISIS to begin with, because its real purpose was to drive the Iranians and the Shiites out of Iraq. But this Frankenstein's monster got out of control, obviously. The people that killed more of them than anybody else are the Russians in Syria, in support of Mr. Assad's regime, which we foolishly have been trying to destroy now for years. But, you know, the bottom line is, I suppose anything is possible. And just bear in mind, this word extremist is tossed around, and you really don't know specifically what that person did or didn't do just because the administration decided to brand him as something. I mean, you can be branded a religious fanatic, a white nationalist, a white supremacist for all sorts of bizarre reasons. Someone can report you and say you said something. Someone can put something on the internet and claim that you did it. This is the sort of sick environment that has grown up in the military. It's a disaster. It destroys morale, undermines discipline. It's the worst possible outcome. And then, of course, you can turn around and be something else that the administration says it likes, and then suddenly it doesn't make any difference what you do.
Yeah, it's totally chaotic right now. I mean, I wanted to get your take, too. I saw this in Revolver News. It says, busted, Biden's Minister of Truth, Nina Jankowicz, participated in a secret NATO-funded cabal to subvert Western democracies using disinformation as cover. Now, I've seen Tucker Carlson report on this report and others, but it's a long story, and I don't know if you've seen it, but the point is that there's this whole group called the Integrity Initiative Defending Democracy Against Disinformation, and it's an organization that it's got funding, operation, I'm reading from the article now, operation structure and rhetoric that has been used to basically create a hornet's nest of NGOs, journalists, national security bureaucrats who work secretly and in concert to wage psychological warfare against citizens of the West. And they use this ploy of, we're just trying to fight disinfo, as their excuse for basically coordinating these attacks against people. Probably you're probably one of the targets of whatever this network is.
Well, first of all, you're correct. And this group really evolved in response to the 9/11 incident. And it came into existence really under the Bush administration in a primitive form. And it was designed to mobilize the population against this mythical thing called the global caliphate. I'm sure you'll remember people talking about that. I mean, for years, the global caliphate was, positioned to take over the world and enslave everyone, destroy everyone. Suddenly, the global caliphate was replaced by China, and then shortly thereafter, Russia. Well, this is a psychological operations approach to shaping information and messaging. And that's why whenever you turn on the mainstream television, go to the internet, cable television, 9 times out of 10, you're going to listen to somebody, usually a retired general who was part of this larger PSYOP, or some other former official or current official, or a journalist or something telling you, well, the Ukrainians are winning. And I sat there the other day and I began laughing because I said, since 24 February, the Ukrainians are winning. And after all of these casualties and the loss of all of this equipment that has disappeared either through criminality or, frankly, being destroyed by the Russians, suddenly the Ukrainians need more and they don't have enough people to fight. But they're winning. And the Russians, they're losing. They're running away, which, of course, is absurd. The exact opposite is the case. But it's all part of this PSYOP. It's all designed to push the nation in a particular direction. And that's very important in Europe as well as here, to push us into a belief system that is ultimately antithetical to our interests, that is counter to the values of Western Christian culture and civilization. That's what we're up against. And so we're now fighting tooth and nail, or want to, against the Russians. We have a proxy war going. But there are now these very dumb ideas floating around about, well, we could send our forces in, as Petraeus noted the other day, as part of a coalition of the willing. Well, if you're part of the NATO alliance, why do you need a coalition of the willing? Well, if NATO feels strongly enough that it should intervene in Ukraine, why hasn't there been a vote? Why hasn't the NATO Council said we are all in agreement? We should intervene in Ukraine and stop the Russians from destroying Ukraine. Well, nobody will do that because most of NATO wants nothing to do with the idea. So now we're talking about a coalition of the willing, which looks like Poles and Romanians. They seem to be the only ones who are willing to risk crossing into Western Ukraine with U.S. forces and being attacked by the Russians for doing so. I mean, it's a very strange situation. And again, why are we so anxious to form this coalition of the willing and intervene in Western Ukraine in support of the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians are winning? They certainly wouldn't need any help or assistance, would they?
So you're suggesting that the Washington has signaled an interest to create this coalition and directly bring military action in Ukraine, even without the excuse of nuclear strike from Russia?
Well, they've been trying to fabricate this notion that the Russians want to use nuclear weapons. Nothing could be further from the truth. And Putin has consistently made it clear that weapons of that nature will only be used in a retaliatory fashion. In other words, unless they are attacked with a nuclear weapon, they will not use a nuclear weapon. And I can tell you that we know the indicators. There's no evidence that any nuclear weapons have been readied for use in that country. So this is a fabrication. And in truth, my greatest concern is that if we were to send forces into Western Ukraine and they were to be destroyed, which I think is almost a certainty if we were to do this, then people in Washington would say, well, we can't afford to be seen as losing, so we're going to have to strike back. And somebody will say, well, with what? We have nothing more to send. And how do we get across the Atlantic with all the Russian submarines in the Atlantic? What are we going to do? And so he said, well, we'll use a nuclear weapon. This is my fear, not that the Russians would do anything of the kind. They won't. And by the way, would we use a nuclear weapon in close proximity to Brownsville, Texas, right across the border from Texas? Of course not, because nuclear weapons produce blast heat and radiation. They extend for tens of miles, sometimes hundreds of miles in their effects. We don't know what the wind, current prevailing winds are down in Texas, but my point is we would never risk such a thing that close to our own border. And that's also true for the Russians. So the notion that they would use this is crazy. On the other hand, the Ukrainians would love to have a nuclear weapon because they're desperate. They're losing. And that's why you've heard these rumors about a dirty bomb. I don't know if they're accurate or not, but the Russians are certainly concerned about it, which is reasonable because you can use spent fuel, in other words, uranium that is being used in a conventional reactor, couple it with conventional explosives and cause an area to become irradiated, which means people will develop radiation sickness. You can destroy crops. You can ruin the water supply. You do a lot of damage within a restricted area, and you can create the illusion that a real nuclear weapon is being used. It takes some time for people to sort out, no, it wasn't, because it's not a plutonium bomb. In other words, it's not enriched to weapons-grade use. So the bottom line is that's not going to happen. But if we were to go in there with our forces and put them at risk and they were destroyed, I do worry about the attitude of people in Washington, because you're talking about people who have made terrible, terrible strategic mistakes to this point, David. I mean, stop and think about it. They decided that Russia was weak, economically backward, its military was ineffective, and it could be destroyed through a proxy war. What they discovered was that Russia has an abundance of resources, most important of which is food and fuel, and that Russia is in a position to shut off the fuel to Europe, the energy to Europe, and the food that would go to Europe, along with a whole host of other things, metals, minerals, and so forth. Russia is virtually self-sufficient. Europe is not. So we've put our allies in a terrible condition. And there are demonstrations today all over Europe happening as we're speaking. In fact, in Romania, there was an enormous demonstration over the weekend against the presence of U.S. forces in Romania and any plan to go to war with Russia. And there were similar demonstrations in other countries. The point is, we've made terrible strategic decisions, and we keep reinforcing the dumb decision by doubling down on the bad policy, which is unnecessary. And the consequences for this could be disastrous if we reinforce it with conventional ground forces.
Yeah, and yet there's no Democrats to join the small group of Republicans in pushing back on this war drum warfare hysteria. The Progressive Caucus, whatever that joke is, they said, we're not going to do anything to stop this. We're going to roll over. We're not going to fight against the war machine. I mean, they've become Dick Cheney and drag the Democratic Party.
Well, remember, that's true, and that's part of the corruption that lurks in the background of everything, because we're also talking about the movement of vast quantities of cash that go from the Hill to the Pentagon to the defense industries and other contractors that are involved in supporting the Ukrainians. And that results in campaign donations and various other ways to legally transfer cash to the Hill. So that's part of the problem. And the other thing is, remember that you've got progressive Republicans. We call them rhinos. They're just Democrats in Republican clothing. Most of the worst of it are in the Senate. I mean, just go down the list of the people who are senators from the Republican Party, and how many are you going to find that have raised objections to the policies? Rand Paul? Absolutely. Mike Lee, some of the time. Who else? What about those that swing the big axe on the Hill? Mitchell, Inhofe, Cruz, Portman, Johnson. I guess Portman's going to go away at the moment, and Johnson may or may not be reelected. But the bottom line is that these Republicans might as well be Democrats. And all of this against the backdrop of our open borders. Open borders, letting millions of people in. We don't know anything about them. We don't know where they're going to end up. But we do know, based on previous experience, that in many states they'll end up voting in elections, whether they're citizens or not. It's horrible. And then we know a lot of them are criminals. And we know that this is human trafficking bound up with the fentanyl disaster. And 100,000 Americans died from fentanyl poisoning last year. I mean, that's as many Ukrainians as have died in the war in the last 7.5 months. Is anybody raising any objections to the commitment of U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine? Has anybody asked, why aren't we sending these forces, the 101st, to the border with Mexico? The 101st would be a great unit to send to the border because of their air mobility and the large quantities of combat infantry. Ideal for that job. So why aren't we protecting our borders? How many Republicans are standing up and asking that question?
And meanwhile, like you said, there seems to be more and more inching closer and closer to direct military involvement in America in Ukraine. So what would that look like? I mean, you talked about in the American Conservative piece the need to do War Powers Act for Congress to invoke that act. But is this something that if America was to officially bring in a coalition and be directly involved with troops on the ground in Ukraine, would Russia get more aggressive in Ukraine on the battlefield, or would they stand back and recalibrate what they're going to do? Well,
right now we know that there is an enormous Russian buildup going on behind the lines down in southern Ukraine, in western Russia, and in Belarus to the north. We know that probably by mid-November you'll have roughly 700,000 Russian troops in the theater. And remember that up until this point in time, only about 20% of the Russian ground force and the Russian army has ever been used. So we're talking about 80,000 combat troops on any given day fighting in Ukraine. Now we're going up to 700,000. And we're talking about enormous quantities of missile and rocket batteries, all the support mechanisms for successful combat. And they all operate within a highly effective integrated air defense system. And contrary to what people have been saying about the Russian Air Force has flown over 70,000 sorties in support of the Russian army in Ukraine to this point. And they're moving in additional bombers and additional fighter bombers, as well as, vast quantities of loitering munitions and unmanned systems. This is going to be unleashed in mid-November. And the goal is to end this war, period, to crush what remains of the Ukrainian forces and end it, because no one will negotiate with Moscow. So Moscow has no choice. If no one will talk to us, if no one is willing to negotiate, then we've got to end it on terms that are favorable to us that will preserve our national security. Now, in the midst of this, we have people talking about committing U.S., Polish, and Romanian forces together, presumably. I'm guessing because the Poles are the only ones that really want to fight the Russians at this stage. And that's disastrous because we don't have the depth in the force. We're not ready to go in there. We're not protected by a very highly integrated air and missile defense system. It's a very dangerous thing to do, and I think people are making false assumptions about the Russians. They're saying, they're not really very good. They'll be intimidated by us. We can bully them. I think they're dead wrong, and I don't understand why they haven't figured that out at this point.
Yeah, it's quite a disturbing situation we find ourselves into, and I don't understand how anybody in D.C. doesn't seem to have a cooler head to be able to say, let's stop this. I think we've done enough here. This is getting to a point. They don't seem to understand the word enough in that town. It's just completely blinded by its own arrogance.
I think that's a good way to put it, David. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you, sir, for joining us. And again, I never mention your stuff, but I want to tell people DouglasMcGregor.com is your website for those who want to see some of your books. So I want to plug that this time, DouglasMcGregor.com. And appreciate you speaking on these matters and trying to make sense of what's going on.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
That's it. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Psychologist named Sarah Edmonds, PhD, just tweeted out on Twitter. She says, my sister's 22-year-old son, who was in transition to become a girl, hung himself last night. Estrogen did not make him happier. And it's that kind of dissenting report, right? That Americans, or anyone for that matter, can be a citizen and report information that contradicts the narratives of the powerful, that has made the society of Silicon Valley and the culture of the billionaire oligarchs and those websites so terrified of allowing a free and open platform to remain. And now we see the emergence of a potential change in at least one of those social media, what I call ghettos, because you get corralled into them and then you get stuck into those frames. You build your brands or whatever, media outlets, dependency on these outlets, and then everything gets rigged. And now we hear the news and we see the video. Elon Musk now coming into the Twitter headquarters, and he tweets out, a beautiful thing about Twitter is how it empowers citizen journalism. People are able to disseminate news without an establishment bias. So joining me now to talk about this development is someone who was deleted and banned off of Twitter. And I wonder if he'll be coming back. The co-host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report and the director of the Ron Paul Institute, Daniel McAdams. How are you, sir?
David, hello. Thanks for having me on your show again.
Yeah, it's great having you back. And, we just had Colonel Douglas Macgregor on before you and talking about foreign policy, and we'll get into that. But I did want to have you on in the comment of this, development that Twitter is now looking like it's being taken over by Elon. What's your take on this development?
Well, it's cautious optimism. I mean, he's a great troll, and I mean that in a great sense. And he's quite the tease. I hope he follows through with what seems like his very simple idea. As in your introduction, it just makes sense to allow free speech. Any kind of legal speech should be allowed. And if that's his goal, I think it's good news. But at the same time, as you say, it is a ghetto, these social media places. So there's a danger. But I think if he comes in and his plan is to fire 75% of the employees and to turn it into a free speech outlet, I think that's where the trends are going, David. I think we may have reached the high watermark of the cancel culture, shut up wokeism. And if that's the case, and Elon really is the trendsetter that a lot of us believe him to be, then I do think it's very good news indeed.
Yeah, it is. He got a lot of flack for a lot of different things he said recently, but he got a lot of flack for suggesting a kind of compromise when it comes to Ukraine. And, he's been giving the Ukrainian side a lot of, donation and help for his satellite program. And yet a lot of them were just so nasty. Hey, my goodness, get out of here. You're a monster. You're on Russia's side for merely suggesting that there should be a peace deal that's imminently worked out. How do you think that aspect, first of all, what do you think of his proposal for a compromise? As this is what you do as foreign policy at the Institute. And secondly, what did you see in terms of the response? Was that a hint at things to come, that perhaps the United States government, NATO, and these different groups are going to really go after a coordinated canceling of Twitter if he makes good on his promise of opening it up?
Well, I think one of the things that it shows us, it really demonstrates the toxicity of the cancel culture, because the cancel culture idea is that we can't even discuss things. Things are completely settled, and if you question them, you by definition are on the side of evil. Now, they tried this with the climate issue. Certainly we had over 2 years of COVID cancel culture, where if you stated the obvious, which is now openly stated, that the shot doesn't prevent transmission or infection. That's absolutely stated now. If you said that a year ago or a year and a half ago, you would have been canceled from social media. So the fact that when Elon Musk waded into the waters of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which, by the way, as you mentioned, he did it having been someone who, it looks like, spent about $80 million to help the Ukrainian side. But when he waded in saying, hey, let's have a debate on this, let's see how we can walk this back. As you point out, he was brutally attacked by the Ukraine backers, including the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, who told him to blank off. And I won't use the word, obviously, on a family program, but you can guess what it was. And then when they complained that he was perhaps not being forthcoming enough to continue funding their communication system, he said, well, I was just doing what you told me, i.e. to blank off. So in a nutshell, that shows the danger of this situation we find ourselves in the 21st century, where you're not allowed to discuss things that have been, quote, solved by the authoritarians, I would call them.
Yeah, now a lot of folks who are in the liberty side of things or anti-establishment say, oh, Elon Musk, he's completely got his money from big government programs, and there's no way he's going to be a true threat to the establishment. How do you see that?
Well, I think Dr. Paul has a lot of those concerns himself, and we're certainly not in the I love Musk camp, so to speak. But, for us, maybe it's just a sign of how bad things are, David. But when it seems like there's someone out there that's having a breath of reason that's saying, hey, we should be talking, you should be allowed to talk, this is a public square, I do hesitate to go overboard, and people do go overboard. And I think that's a sign of desperation, that they go overboard and think this is the second coming. He's not. But if he starts moving us in the right direction, as you know, big things start with small things. The Berlin Wall came down with some very, very minor events in June of 1989. But once these events go into motion, they have a way.
Looks like we might have lost Daniel there for a moment, right when he was getting to the punchline of what he was saying there. Daniel, do we have you back? Not sure. We'll see if we can try to reconnect with him live on A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I think that the things that we're living in right now are very, very pivotal moments that could really shape a lot of things in our lives. If the internet is able to start being cancel culture resilient, right?
Hello?
If we're able to, hey there, Daniel McAdams, we got you back, right? Yes.
Sorry, sounded like the call was dropped. Sorry about that.
Okay, but go ahead. I was just saying that this is a really interesting moment where if the internet can really become resilient to cancel culture, and Elon is able to make a safe space for free discourse, where you can tweet out about your critiques of the war without having it weighted and shadow banned and throttled and harder for people to see on their timeline or whatever. If that can happen, that could really be a big moment of change to move the country back to sanity, because sane ideas will be able to be seen and heard more easily, right?
And that's one of the reasons I think they want the cancel culture and the shut up culture, is they know that their positions can't bear scrutiny, so they don't want to debate. The idea that we can't even talk about some $67 billion that we've sent over to Ukraine with zero accounting, by the way. Remember what happened when Senator Paul said, okay, I know I can't stop this money, but can we at least send a couple accountants over there to see where it goes? And he was, practically, read the riot act out of town. When we can start talking about things like that, I think the weakness of the other side's position will become obvious. So that's one good thing. But the other danger really is, David, is that I think the train, perhaps may have left the station, because, for example, the cancel culture on YouTube has led to the rise of other alternatives like Rumble, where lots of people are going. People like Glenn Greenwald with huge audiences. The Ron Paul Liberty Report moved its live show to Rumble earlier this year. So the market does have a way of reacting to needs. So I think if Elon takes over Twitter, he's going to have to get in high gear to restore that, because people are going elsewhere.
Yeah, I saw Elon Musk tweeting out, the New York Times has emerged as a new chaotic actor in global politics. The paper's interventions in some of the world's most combustible conflicts have sometimes been a boon, but their messaging has also caused problems, according to unnamed sources close to the matter who wish to remain anonymous. That's his little troll there. So, he's going after these old, iconic legacy institutions like the New York Times and making them look ridiculous. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. You mentioning your show, you recently, earlier in the week, interviewed the candidate running for U.S. Senate in Arizona, Blake Masters, who is signaling from my interactions with him, interviewing him, talking to him, that he seems to be pretty strong on critiquing and challenging the Federal Reserve, challenging big tech, pushing back on some of the sacred cow consensus about war and perpetual forever wars. What was your overall impression of having interviewed him with Dr. Paul?
It was great to meet Blake, and Dr. Paul and I were both impressed. We were impressed to hear the story of how he got. Dr. Paul always loves to hear people say, well, how did you come to our ideas? And it turns out he was a kid in high school, and he and his dad were hearing about these campaigns of Ron Paul in 2008, and Blake started reading like Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises. He started reading Lew Rockwell. And so, as you know, I mean, these are our shared heroes. So it sounds like he really started on solid ground. You're not going to see a lot of people in the Senate, I'd say maybe one other, who's read Rothbard and Mises. So, we're very optimistic on that. Obviously, there were some minor disagreements in some areas, but that's, if you get the basics and you understand things about the free market and peace, he's going to be a great asset. His numbers are rising. The momentum is in his favor right now. And while I never believe an election is really going to save us, I would love to see him being successful in Arizona, and many other people, including the wonderfully talented woman running for governor in Arizona and many other places, too. So the backlash is there. Let's hope the momentum swings in the right direction. But obviously, politics isn't going to save us, David. There's only one thing that can save us.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, but nobody wants to follow that path, it seems like. But, there's other folks running for Senator. I think General Bolduc, I think out of New Hampshire, I think he's kind of anti-interventionist a little bit. I've seen his stuff before at some of the anti-war veterans groups and meetings and so forth. So it'd be interesting to see. I don't know what his current. I haven't really followed that race, but if he wins that Senate seat in New Hampshire, that could be another war skeptic in the Senate. What was your take on seeing the? Go ahead.
I was just going to say I've seen a couple of very terrible clips of him, so I hope that maybe everyone can change. Yeah. We all believe in redemption. Hopefully, the things I saw were things that are far in the past.
Right. Yeah. What's your take on the Progressive Caucus totally dropping the ball and pushing back against the Ukraine interventionism?
It's amazing. I mean, it was shocking. First of all, the letter they sent was very milquetoast, very, very gentle. And obviously, as Dr. Paul said on our program today, everything they did in this entire episode was all about one thing: politics, not principles. It was all about politics. They could see, and the numbers are definitely there when you talk about polling numbers about the war and the possibility of World War II. Americans are becoming very, very concerned about it. So they put their finger up to the wind, and they wrote a very gentle letter to the president saying, hey, we love everything you're doing. Keep sending all the guns and bombs and weapons. But, could you maybe pick up a phone and have a little bit of diplomacy? And then the doo-doo hit the fan, and they got a very stern lecture, and they said, that was a staffer. That wasn't us. And, that was I was on the Hill for a long time, and blaming it on a staffer, it's possible that it could have happened, but that's a pretty low blow, I think.
Hey, what a pathetic! They have totally embraced their Wilsonian roots, haven't they?
Well, what happened, I think, is that basically this letter came out, very gentle letter, and they got a phone call from some people in the White House saying, do you realize that Kevin McCarthy just a few days ago said if Republicans take over, they're going to reconsider all this aid to Ukraine? Do you really want to be on the side of Kevin McCarthy as we go into these critical elections just 2 weeks away? You are on the side of the crazy far right, because we know Kevin McCarthy is such a radical, right? But I think that's what happened, and it gave him cold feet. It was disappointing, but not unsurprising to see politics, unfortunately, once again overtake what Dr. Paul spent so much time doing on the Hill, which is creating a beyond left-right coalition against war. And it's very sad to see that hasn't come back. And in fact, the only, as you suggested earlier, the only exciting anti-war voices that we're seeing are coming from the right or the Republican side. So that's maybe a little bit of a silver lining in the dark cloud.
Yeah, it just takes a few folks in the Senate to really change the game, especially if the Republicans take over the Senate. Mitch McConnell's going to have a harder time if these people keep their backbone and work together. Just 3 or 4 senators with some creativity and some compelling messaging can really stop a lot of this war machine stuff from going on that level. I think it seems.
On everything too. I mean, if Senator Paul gets a chairmanship, I mean that will be huge. And for him to go into that with something, I mean, the Senate is way different than the House. The House, it was tough because there were so many of them. But in the Senate, Senator Paul with the chairmanship, with Senator Masters, Senator Lee, and a few others that can be counted on to be pretty good on not just war, but the issue of the so-called pandemic and what about all the corruption? What about the Fed? I mean, so many things can happen with just a very small handful of senators. So that's one reason I think it would be huge if Blake gets in.
Yeah, there certainly hasn't been enough done on the pandemic scam and what that whole thing was with the criminal fraud that I believe has been perpetrated with the Pfizer vaccines and so forth. I mean, I think there needs to be serious consequences for all the liars and the colluders that were doing things really, really horribly against people. And so many people lost their lives as a result and lost their businesses. Daniel, it's one of those things where it was so traumatic. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people don't want to talk about it, but you have to. People just want to turn the page and act like it never happened, But
they'll do it again if they get away with it. That's the message.
That's right. Daniel McAdams, I appreciate you coming on the program, and I know you're busy going on different venues trying to spread the message of freedom and peace, and so always great to hear from you when you can stop by and share your ideas with us.
Thank you very much, David.
I expect you to be taking India social media by storm again one of these days, too. I think you've got a base of fans over there that could be in the millions in India.
I'm ready. I'll even run for office there. I love India.
Very good. So check out RonPaulLibertyReport.com for catching their show, or subscribe to them on Rumble. Thanks again.
Thank you.
That's it for Hour 1, folks. When we return, we're going to dive into some more headlines, and then we're going to hear from Tucker Goodrich and dive into the latest on his research in nutrition and vegetable oils, looking at LDL and how that actually works. So you don't want to miss that. In the meantime, you can call in with your thoughts at 727-587-1040. That's 727-587-1040. Or email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. While you're at our website, put your email in. You'll get our weekly update of our content highlights from that week, including online-only video conversations that you don't want to miss. So do that today at neighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.